wherever you're at. Hopefully not evening yet, but hello everyone. I'm really excited to get started. I've been wanting to deliver a presentation of this sort for a while now. Can you all see my screen? Like, what do you see actually? Let me see.
We
It's just
lost you.
black. I
It's
saw
just
it
black.
slide.
Okay, hold on 1 second.
I briefly saw your title
Uh-huh.
presentation, but then it went black.
Okay. Okay. How about now?
Yes.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you. All right, y'all. So I am, like I said, really excited to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart. Virginia and I have been talking a great deal about, trying to get the fellows to think more about DEI and J, justice. Some people call it JEDI. They emphasize the justice first, and then equity, diversity, inclusion. Whatever acronym you are using, these are all very incredibly important terms to consider in your research. So I'd like to deliver a presentation just to kind of help you to think about what that might look like in your research process. More specifically, I'll go ahead and show you all the agenda that I have planned for today. So I do want to start off with just a brief discussion in the chat, and then we can talk out loud about what is your why in research, because I don't know if we can effectively talk about DI and J in research without really going back to the basics. And that is like, why the heck are we even doing this in the first place? So I do want to take an opportunity to maybe unpack that just a little bit. And then of course, I'm all, very big about definitions. So I do want to define what exactly is DEI-J research. Again, we've kind of like clumped a whole bunch of terms here. And so I definitely want to make sure that I'm being intentional about how we're defining that type of research. Why should we do this type of research? A lot of people think that it's a moral imperative, and it certainly is, but there are other reasons why we should be incorporating this type of lens in our research. And I do want to kind of talk about this through the lens of both quantitative and qualitative research, because it kind of looks a little different, but there are some similarities as well. And then hopefully, we will have some time to do this activity. I have a few research abstracts in which I want us to read through. And I want you all to kind of delineate and guess whether or not you think the abstract is an example or potentially an example of DEIJ oriented research. And yes, Oya, the recording should be available afterwards. So again, I was kind of telling Michael this as well. If you all need to take care of yourself, if you need to hop off, things of that sort, I am not going to take it personally. This will be recorded. But hopefully you'll be able to stay towards the end, because again, I do have an activity plan for us. And then one last thing before we begin our brief discussion, I do not claim to be all knowing about a lot of these methods that we're talking about. I'm drawing from my own professional experience, even personal experiences. That's my knowledge bank here. This presentation is not meant to be comprehensive, because honestly, y'all, there's so much that we can talk about in relation to DEIJ oriented research, whether it be, for example, like how you sample participants, the actual design of your research process, the politics even, right? And ethics behind methodology. There's just so much that you can talk about. And it's just incredibly impossible to cram it all into an hour presentation or workshop of some sort. However, I do hope that towards the end of this presentation, or when you are done watching this presentation, if you do have to watch the second half at a later date, that it does get you to think about your research in a different way, in a way that maybe you didn't prior to listening to this presentation. So with that being said, let's go ahead and take a few moments to have this discussion. And basically what I want you all to do is to consider, what is your why in your research agenda or in your research in general. You don't have to very quickly write this down in the chat. I am going to ask you in a second to put it in the chat, but really go back to the basics here before we go into, why it's important to frame our research through using the lens of equity and justice. So yeah, why are you doing research outside of the fact that, of course, your role, might require it in some capacity, but what are you trying to accomplish? So yeah, I'll give you maybe a minute or so to really think about that, minute or two. And then when you're ready, go ahead and put it in the chat. And I'll be doing it as well. I never ask people to do things that I don't also do. So I'll go ahead and mute myself, and then a couple of minutes, I'll see what's in the chat here. Okay, we have some good stuff coming in here. I put mine in the chat as well. I know there maybe might be a couple more people thinking about this. So we have one response that says the world needs research in diversity, equity, social justice, and belonging. You feel you are making a difference and contributing something. This is my why. I can really relate to that, like a whole lot. Especially now where it seems like, at least for me, the world is kind of closing in here in the US. There's just so much going on. And so going back and revisiting that why is really, really helpful. Virginia put, I want to increase access to quality learning experiences. Absolutely. I'm curious, Virginia, how you would define quality, not in an interrogative way, but just a true curiosity here. And then she went on to say this involves testing whether or not learning experiences are quality for all involved, for sure. And then Michael put to raise awareness of female invisibility of pioneering psychologists, even in OER psychology textbooks, with the hope that this will be ameliorated, excuse me, in the future and spark research into diverse content in all OER. I love that. And I'm really curious actually about your research, Michael. So I'm glad you phrased it that way. And then y'all saw my why. I won't read it out loud, but yeah, I mean to paraphrase it at least. My why is really to humanize those who have been historically dehumanized, especially in the context of education. And very similar to Virginia, I have this broad goal of access to education in a way that kind of facilitates this humanizing process, if you will, for those who have been historically dehumanized or marginalized. And then Andy puts, the more I studied language acquisition and bilingualism, the more I realized that common teaching practices undermine the process, absolutely, and send the wrong message to students about what language is and isn't. Being transparent and truthful allows for students to tap into their multilingual selves without shame. I really like that. Bethany put, I research to support those who are already doing such great work for providing quality access to education, to understand their work better. Excellent. And then Michael said that he might actually redo it, that his why is that all people should see themselves represented in OER content. I look for this as a child myself, absolutely. So the phrase that representation matters and that it's powerful. And that, of course, is true in OER content as well. So thank you all so much for sharing that. Like I said, important to ground ourselves and to remind ourselves why we're doing this research. I think in higher education, academia more specifically, we get so caught up in productivity that we kind of get disconnected. And so I encourage you all, not only in the time that you're here in this fellowship, but also your entire tenure as a researcher to really keep that in mind, especially during, times like, currently. So let's go ahead and transition into talking about and defining what exactly is DEIJ research. You'll hear me say like just DEIJ research and then also DEIJ oriented research. Here I'm kind of meaning the same thing. And like I said earlier, whatever acronym you choose to use, whether it's DEIJ, DEIA, JEDI, I mean, there's a lot of different acronyms going on here because again, these terms tend to be clumped together. They are trying to accomplish, while they have distinct purposes, they are trying to drive us towards a common destination, I would argue. And so that destination, at least the way that I'm defining it here, is really research that has an equity and justice oriented goal, right? And what does that exactly mean? It means really intentionally examining what we call systems of power, systems of privilege. And again, I use the word intentionally because it's not something that we're adding on after the fact. It's something that is really baked into our entire research process. And because of that, because we are taught in our graduate school programs or even within our own units as faculty members, we are taught methodologies that have pretty, for lack of better words, icky histories, right? They have certain politics that are centered that unfortunately have harmed marginalized people. And so I would argue centering DEIJ in your research design, in your methodologies, and even some of the questions that you ask, you really have to do almost extra work to unlearn some of what you've been taught in order to center this DEIJ lens. And so, like I just said, sometimes the way in which we do quote unquote traditional research or research that uses methodologies that have been prioritized, for lack of better words, we have found, and meaning scholars of color, women of color, women scholars have found that some of those methodologies have harmed marginalized communities. And those include women, those include people with disabilities, queer folks, and of course, people of color. And so when we're using some of these methodologies that don't account for these diverse experiences, this really leads us to not truly understanding how these unique experiences function, right? And that could lead to us in producing what I feel like are ineffective interventions and support for these types of communities. And so not thinking about DEIJ in the research process really has some grave implications. So I think about more specifically how women were not historically included in health research, right? Which signals how medical professionals to this day are unsure of how to effectively treat certain issues and diseases and disorders that disproportionately affect women, such as autoimmune diseases, because this type of research is still greatly underfunded. But we won't get into the politics of that too much, but just know that DEIJ research tries to address something like that. And then research without a DEIJ lens also tends to produce a deficient based interpretation of marginalized folks' experiences. And again, I'll touch on this in a little more detail later on in the presentation, but this really creates this imagery that people of color or women, people with disabilities, or those who have intersections of all of those identities and some identities that I didn't even mention, really presents this imagery that they're weak, they're vulnerable, instead of asking or having an inquiry that asks, what can we learn about these communities, right? What assets are already present in these communities instead of like, oh, this is where they're failing, okay? And then my second point there, DEIJ research also helps us to really critically analyze traditional ways of doing research. So when I read this, kind of phrase here at the bottom of my slide, I think of, for example, how higher ed and academia has excluded, for example, indigenous ways of knowing and producing research through storytelling and community witnessing, and how sometimes that's not regarded as research because they're not using Western methodologies, or those Western methodologies are not prioritized in indigenous ways of knowing. It doesn't make sense in that particular context. So DEIJ research really attempts to acknowledge this eraser, but also center this type of marginalization that is happening in this process as well. And so there's a lot of different types of DEIJ oriented research. This list that you see here is not an exhaustive list at all. These are just some of the types of research that I myself have either been involved in or some of the more common themes of DEIJ research that you hear. So feminist research, research that's really invested in gender equity and gender equality. It's not just research about women. So that's a question I get a lot about feminist research. Again, feminist research is about the, examining systems of power as it relates to gender. And that includes transgender individuals as well. Anti-racist research, so research that seeks to dismantle white supremacy and to kind of reimagine this world without white supremacy as the core. Activist approaches to research, that's pretty straightforward. So that really has a very strong social justice core to it. Crit quant, or critical quantitative methods. Virginia and I have talked about this in a lot of detail, but I'm going to actually talk about this in detail during today's presentation. Hopefully I'll have time because I'm noticing, oh my gosh, it's 12:20 already, and I have so much I want to talk about with y'all. But if I don't, maybe what I can do is perhaps even talk about it in a little more detail in a separate presentation. And then how many of you all have heard of participatory action research? Anyone ever heard of that? Okay, a couple people have. Virginia, Bethany, I think Andy had their hand up. Okay, a couple of folks. So this is when essentially you invite your quote unquote participants into the research design process. And because, or I would say because that helps to interrogate traditional ways of doing research. And it really creates a slightly more democratic way of doing research as opposed to I'm the researcher, I'm all knowing, I'm going to create the research questions and I'm going to extract this information from the community instead of thinking of ways that I can go back and invest again in this community that I've actually researched, right? I'm seeing there's something in the chat. Oh yeah, Oya just said yes, that she's heard of it. Okay. And there's a lot more. Again, I'm going to touch on crit quant and participatory action research a little bit later on, but just know that there are so many different types of DEIJ oriented research. And so with this type of research, there are some guiding principles that I would love you all to maybe pay close attention to. And I think it's important to do this because, again, since we're clumping different terms here when we're talking about DEIJ research, it can be kind of hard to figure out, okay, is this what she's talking about? Is this not? And so I've kind of tried to reduce it down to a few principles that'll help you to kind of figure out what are some characteristics associated with this type of research. However, this list is not exhaustive at all. So later on, I'm going to also share what is not DEIJ research because I see, how do I say this with kindness? I think I see a lot of researchers who have really good intentions in terms of like wanting to touch on subjects related to DEI and J, and will even claim that their research is doing that type of work, but it's not. And again, later on, it'll maybe make a little bit more sense. So the first principle is honestly kind of a bare minimum ask. I'm being honest with you. So if you want to do DEIJ research, you have to ensure that you are doing this type of research for the purpose of centering marginalized stories and honestly doing this with care, right? So we don't want to just include marginalized communities in a way that ends up tokenizing their experience, right? Or used as merely a comparison point to those who have been historically privileged or in positions of power. So here in the US, and I would argue in Canada to a certain degree as well, this maintains the notion that white or male men or Western, like those principles, those notions, if you will, they're the norm, right? And anyone that deviates from that is abnormal. So I always encourage people, if you really want to incorporate more of a DEI lens, try not to do, for example, white students compared to students of color, because that just maintains that abnormal versus normal category there. And so also, when we're talking about centering voices that have been marginalized, I think that also means asking yourself, what is it that you want to learn? right? By doing this, what is it that you actually want to understand? What is it that you want to elevate about this particularly marginalized community, and for what purpose? So that's really, really important to consider. I think sometimes we want to add in voices that have been historically marginalized because we know morally that's the right thing to do, but we're not thinking about how that actually informs the purpose of our research. Does that make sense, y'all? I don't know if that. Okay. Okay. Awesome. The second principle, which of course, when we're doing DEIJ oriented research, we do have to consider how power and privilege operate, not only inside of the research process, but outside of the research process as well. And so this goes beyond, for example, just having a variety of lived experiences reflected in your study, but also what broader systems of oppression, patterns of power and privilege inform these experiences. So it's not enough to be like, okay, for some reason, Black students are not performing as well on, the SAT compared to white students. Well, what broader systems have contributed to that? We can't just look at it in just an isolated individual bucket. Okay. And I'll talk about that hopefully in a little more detail later on. And then also consider when we're talking about, considerations of power and privilege, and I feel like I kind of just said this, but just to kind of be a little bit more repetitive, consider what histories are present in your data and how does this affect your interpretation of the data, right? So I think it's extremely, extremely critical for us to be good students of the populations we seek to study in our research, right? All the populations we seek to study in order to really yield more accurate interpretations of our data. So I think that's going to be very important going forward. If you do want to, for example, if your goal is to be more inclusive in terms of your sample size of people who you're actually studying, I think you should study their histories alongside, right? It's very, very important. And then also, it entails you examining your own position as a researcher and how this affects the research process. So, in other words, what knowledge are you bringing into this process, and what instances of power and privilege are present within this knowledge? Okay. So, again, how is it that you're positioning yourself as a researcher? How does that affect your participants, right? That notion of power. And then again, I'll unpack that hopefully later on in today's presentation as well when I talk about qualitative research, because that is a practice that's very common in qualitative research, or at least it should be. And then the third principle I want to talk about, of course, engaging in research practices that are open, that are community oriented, that involve folks from the community, right? That are transparent. This third principle is actually, in a lot of ways, reflected a little bit and articulated in the Belmont report, which, of course, in the US, I know we have a couple people from Canada. In the US, it's a report that summarizes ethical principles and guidelines for human subject research. And so this research essentially that we're doing, we're using a DEIJ lens, it should be beneficial for all. It should actually serve the needs of the community. It should be collaborative in nature, things of that sort. Okay. I won't get into the politics of ethics, like research ethics in this presentation in too much detail, but I do want to encourage you as researchers to think about what kinds of ethics you're centering in your research. Does that make sense? And why you're centering those ethics. It's not to say you shouldn't, but just taking a moment and doing a kind of self-reflection. What ethics, what values am I centering? And how does that inform the questions that I'm asking? How does that inform my design? How does that even inform how I'm looking and interpreting my data here? Okay. I'm going to pause because I see a few things in the chat. Oh yes, Oya said that she's grateful that that her university has engagement groups we can consult for research. Oh, that's so awesome. I do research with youth and always consult the youth engagement group and get their feedback. And I'm going to talk about that in light of PAR, participatory action research, how sometimes we call those consulting teams, and that's so imperative in the process as well. And then Virginia put that she started writing positionality statements for these reasons to work towards these goals. I'm actually going to be talking about positionality in just a second here. It's been a really big mind shift. My quant research training has been to think of the research as perfectly objective and unbiased, but that is not possible. I'm sorry to those. There might be someone in the talk right now who loves the notion of neutrality and objectivity. Um, I don't believe in it, and so I am also going to kind of touch on that a little bit later on as well, because I do acknowledge that a lot of quantitative research are taught that quantitative methodologies are objective, therefore they're more superior compared to qualitative methods. But there's all kinds of assumptions and bias in all kinds of research. You just have to figure out as a researcher which bias or yeah, which lens or bias are you comfortable with, I guess you can say. So a couple more guiding principles because I feel like I'm talking way too much, but let me know if you need a moment, if I need to pause or answer any questions. DEIJ research is not invested in extracting information from communities without thinking about how we can also invest in those communities. So, a great deal of academic research does just that. It's very extractive, it's very transactional. I'm thinking of an article actually I read just recently to prepare for this presentation by an NGO. I think their name is literally Systemic Justice. Y'all can look it up. But they define extractive research, I'm kind of paraphrasing this as research that entails funding, producing, the dissemination of research that doesn't really uplift the community that they're researching, especially those communities who have been historically marginalized. So here they're arguing that a lot of the research that we see coming out of the academy, for lack of better words, it's self-serving, right? So it's for the academics' interest, it's for the interest of institutions, it's for the interest of even politicians, right? Or private foundations that might be funding some of our research. And so DEIJ research really tries to minimize this transactional research. It goes away from just focusing on the individual's career. And we want to acknowledge that's important. But the main priority here is to do research for the purpose of the cause, right? So the actual issue that we're trying to elevate and better understand here. And then the second point here involving key partners in the research. I'm going to talk about that in a little more detail when I get to participatory action research. So think about who are key partners that might be helpful in your research process beyond just you as a researcher and then your participants. I'm sure there's other partners that you might be able to think about that you can include in this research design process if you just take a moment, right, and do that. And then my second to last point here, DEIJ-oriented research is non-essentialist in nature. So in other words, we are not in the business of grouping people together like they have the same experience, that they're homogeneous in nature. So in other words, disaggregating data is going to be really important, especially for my quant researchers when it is possible. And Crit Quant gets into a lot of detail about how to do that, which, by the way, if you need me to send you more resources about anything that I've talked about in the presentation, please let me know and I'd be happy to send that to you all. And again, the last point here, I've already kind of talked about this, but DEIJ research is really just rooted in equity and justice. Like we always come back to that. And the way that I'm defining justice is social justice, like I did in the scope framework, where it's this corrective and liberatory process, corrective in the sense of really addressing and dismantling systems of oppression and thinking about how do we rebuild our world so that it is more inclusive and is more just. So a couple of things. DEIJ research is not the following. And I've seen this happen honestly a lot. If you've even done this in your research, that is okay. I just want to kind of dispel maybe some misconceptions of what this research is. So it is not just saying, okay, well, I'm going to include Latina students in my sample size. So check, I've done the research, or I'm doing research at an HBCU. Therefore, it's inherently DEIJ research, right? The reason why I say it's not DEIJ research alone by just including people, because again, you have to have the goal of equity and justice at the core of what you're doing, right? So you can include marginalized people in your data set, but how you're actually interpreting that data, the type of methodologies you're using, that may or may not uphold the goal of equity and justice. So be very, very careful about that. Got a question here, Michael.
Yeah. I learned in social work school that
Mm-hmm.
depending on the food you eat, you might metabolize medication differently. So
Mm-hmm.
when you test medications to on the predominant social group, ethnic group of whites, you might get different results than if you tested it on marginalized groups because they have different
Right.
types of food. So if you said, okay, I'm gonna now do a study on like Latino, different,
Mm-hmm.
pick a group in that so that I can know if the medications work for them. In that case, would that intrinsically be DEIJ research?
Mm. That's a great question. I would argue I would need to know a little bit more information. So I think that alone is on the right track, but it also depends on what kind of research questions are you asking. Again, why are you including this group in your research design, right? How are you interpreting the data? Are you including, again, like I was saying earlier, the reasons why, right? That I think you were saying like the food metabolizes differently. Are there broader systems, like whether that's access to food, the types of food that you have access to, right? That
Mm.
affect, again, this is beyond the actual topic, is beyond my expertise. But those are the type of questions that I would ask in order to really figure out whether or not it is DIJ research. But I would say if you just stopped there, what you just said, I would say you're stopping too soon, to be quite transparent with you. So
Okay, thanks.
you do see a lot of research like that, to be honest. So yeah, that's a good question. Thank you so much. Other questions? Okay. Um, forget what, oh yeah, so yeah, not just including, people who have been marginalized. We have to do a little bit more than that. Um, my second point here, I've talked about this already, but sometimes in the research that we see about marginalized people, especially those who are racially minoritized, it tends to come from this deficient standpoint. So, for example, Black students are not performing as well in K through 12 compared to other students because they come from poverty affected backgrounds and they come from communities that are riddled with crime. Great. That's inspiring research, right? And so what we want to try to do in this type of research is go beyond this deficit, way of interpreting things and really looking at the broader patterns here. Gloria Ladson Billings, who I'm sure some of you are familiar with her work, she's a very, very well-known education scholar. During one of her keynotes that I had the privilege of listening to, she said, I mean, she has like a 50-year career in education, so she's super well versed. And she said, a quote in her keynote, while other scholars were asking what was wrong with Black students, she had the audacity to ask what's right about them, what is good about them, what can we learn about them, right? And so it's just that framing, right, that we can do as researchers that makes a world of a difference. Because, and I'll talk about this later on as well, which I don't, later on might be another presentation now that I'm talking, but oh shoot, I lost my train of thought. Good Lord. I'll come back to it. But at any rate, yes. So I love that just reframing of, how we're looking at our participants. Oh, yes, that's what I was going to say. Because if we're using that deficit lens, right, our research, y'all, we have a responsibility as researchers because our research can and does inform policy, it informs norms, right? So we have to be very, very, very careful of the way in which we're looking at our data set and the type of lens that we are using. Okay. And so that's why I said it's so important to actually study the histories and experiences of the people in your sample population and not just looking at them as numbers or, interviews that you have to code. And then my second to last point, we know that in academia, we're, especially if we are on the tenure track, we're under a great deal of pressure to be productive in our research program. And so it lends it to be more of a doing research for the sake of knowledge production, for the sake of getting tenure. And knowledge production alone is not going to do anything to elevate the experiences of marginalized communities, right? Especially if that research remains in the academy. So that's not what DEIJ research is about, okay? And then let's see here. And then I've already talked about this a little bit here. So in DEIJ research, we do very much reject the notion of objectivity and neutrality. I am going to say something a little controversial for my quant scholars out there. P-values, chi-squares, those are man-made concepts, technically, right? So this idea that research can be 100% objective, especially in quantitative research, is rejected in DEIJ-oriented research. And the goal here is not necessarily to pursue neutrality, but again, is to pursue equity and social justice in our research. That's what it really is meant to do. Oh, thank you, Andy. All right, so I'm seeing we have 20 minutes left, and like I always do, I pack in a lot more than what I intended. So what I would like to do is talk about, let's see, maybe why we want to do DI research. I don't know if I'll have time to do quant versus qual. I don't know if you all would be interested in me doing perhaps another presentation where I really break this down, quant versus qual. Would that be okay? I think I might do that, Virginia, because I don't want to rush through the last part. And I do want to get to the activity just to kind of see how this information that I've given you all, how it's kind of processing. And speaking of processing, I know I've already given you a lot of information. So I acknowledge that there might be some processing that still needs to be done. Okay, so this part I'm going to kind of breeze past a little bit because I've pretty much talked about a lot of this. But the reason why we want to do DEIJ research, honestly, y'all, it's really teaching us as researchers how to be more human and to look at our subjects as human. And I would argue that sometimes this is particularly difficult to do if you come from a graduate program or a department where, for example, numbers, your data set is often detached from the histories that are associated with those numbers and with your data set here. I've also kind of hinted at the Belmont report kind of already touches on elements related to DEIJ research. And again, the Belmont report is here in the US. I think justice, actually not I think, I know justice is one of the core principles for ethical human research. So again, this is kind of already happening. And I believe in that report when they talk about justice, the authors, they're bringing up questions like who should receive the benefits of research and who bears its burden. And also, I believe it talks about concepts related to fairness and distribution. And I think there's another one that talks about like what is deserved in this research. And then also DEIJ research enables us to be, as I put here, more accurate in our research interpretation. So in the US and Canada, I would argue, there's a lot of research that maybe overrepresents the experiences of white people, white men in particular. And they're using these experiences to kind of be generalized to everyone, right? So yeah, I mean, our entire sample population was all white guys, but I mean, everyone has the same experience as a white guy, right? No. So again, DEIJ research kind of rejects this notion that whiteness or maleness is universal for everyone or the norm for everyone. And then a couple other reasons why DEIJ research is so important in our work, y'all. I've already talked about this, the fact that we have an ethical we have a responsibility when we're interpreting our data, and we need to do this with ethics and care because it does inform policy. It truly, truly does. And then I remember Rajiv Jangiani talking about this when I first heard him talk years ago about open access and why he's so invested in open access. The fact that, we're doing research that is a lot of times funded by taxpayer dollars, but yet the general public can't access that research. That doesn't make any sense. And so not only should we consider that, but also it's important to do DEIJ research because it should be action oriented. It should inform policy change. It should inform or better the communities that we're actually researching. Okay. And so I want to end before we get into our activity, in terms of like how to be more intentional about DEIJ research. I've already talked about this in a little detail, but maybe consider, for example, when you're trying to figure out how do I diversify my research team, for example, think to yourself, why are you bringing people onto the team? So in other words, you can't just, for example, bring a Latina woman onto your team just because she's a Latina woman, right? Like, what exactly are you trying to? What is the purpose of having this quote unquote diverse research team? And then also, and I got this quote here, a couple of quotes from the University of Minnesota. They did a great job talking about DEI research and talking about how when we're doing DEIJ oriented research, making sure that we are focusing on the equity and justice component as well. It's very easy for us to just focus on D&I, like diversifying our population, including marginalized people, but not really understanding the broader things that are at play. So, in other words, last year I was listening to a podcast where I was learning more about crit quant. And Dr. I think his name is Juan, oh gosh, Juan Garebe. I think that's how you pronounce his last name. He's a professor at the University of Virginia. And he discussed how his doctoral program did not encourage him to think about health, education, environmental issues that affected communities that he was researching from a broader systemic lens, but rather from an individual lens. So, for example, he thought, Latina people have higher cases of diabetes because of poor eating choices, right? Instead of thinking about the broader systems that affect, like we kind of talked about earlier with Michael's example, access to food or limits food options here. And so not connecting the issues being researched to the broader systemic issues affected how his program taught methodologies, methods, and research design. So this really resonated with me a lot when I was listening to this because believe it or not, y'all actually started off being a quant researcher in my first grad program. And I was taught the same. I know Virginia's up here laughing, like, what? Yeah, that lasted for all of a year. Um, but and not again, nothing against quant. And you hear this so much in academia, like quant versus qual research. I mean, it's what questions are you interested in answering? That's what it boils down to. Like, what speaks to you? There's not one methodology that's superior to another. But, anyways, I just remember feeling the same way that my data set was not connected to the people, to the broader issues that I was trying to examine. And so I just appreciate him, explaining that. And I think that is particularly important as we look at DIJ research. And then again, talked about research productivity and how that's a norm in academia, right? And sometimes I wonder, and this maybe is a question that I'd love for you all to think about until maybe our next meeting. And that question is, how do you think academia's culture of productivity and the need for outcome, right? How do you believe, or how do you think that constrains our ability to be more community oriented in our research? Again, you don't have to answer that now, but maybe that's just something to consider, even for you as a researcher. So I'll go ahead and pause there. I see a couple of things in the chat. Oh, yes, yes, Virginia. Thank you so much. Yeah. Well, I want to hear your thoughts, Andy. Maybe the next I mean, you can share now. I would love to hear now. What are your initial thoughts on that?
I mean, this is just something that I have thought a lot about, particularly because in linguistics, there's this huge deficit of long-term studies And I think that that's the direct result of, the system that we live in, is that, I would love to do a lot more long-term studies,
Yeah.
but for my institution, like, I'm expected to publish something every year or publish a book, which is a little bit more long-term, but like it still doesn't allow for like that long-term study. And that's just not built into our institutions. And so being able to do work that would actually be more impactful and meaningful is, you know, undermined by the way that we evaluate research at our institutions. And I could go on for so long, but I'll leave it at that.
Oh, no, no, no. I would love to hear more. I'm actually getting really excited because this is making me think of like other workshops, if you will, that we maybe need to do for you all. Just maybe even just discussions, not even workshops, just discussions. Yeah. Virginia put in the chat that she's had multiple senior faculty tell me that longitudinal high impact work should wait until after tenure. I've heard that because of the time investment and need to show productivity. I took a life history methodologies class last year, and it was an amazing class. And this actually, Virginia, you saying that reminded me of what my professor said, and she said there's an increasing need for slow scholarship, like really just sitting. I know, right? Like really just sitting with this research that you're doing, right? And having a moment to actually just think about it instead of, oh, I got to get this article in by the deadline. And especially those who are on the tenure track. I mean, it's just so intense. And so when she said this notion of slow scholarship, I said, wow, that would be great. And so what do we need to do institutionally, but what can we do even as scholars, as researchers, to engage in that slow scholarship even when it feels like it's impossible, right? But yeah, I definitely would love to discuss that in more detail. Michael said in psychology treatments, they that aren't easy to study are at a disadvantage. Absolutely. So and I would argue, Michael, it's not just psychology. I think a lot of the social sciences, if we can't get it out here fast, if it's not easy to study, don't focus on that right now. If it's too hard to operationalize, to create a research study, like just wait for that. Yes,
And that's
absolutely.
also why we end up with so many studies that examine college populations,
Yeah.
right? Like, because like, hey, I have college students here and I can offer them extra credit to do my study. And all of a sudden we have, just a plethora of studies that look at 18 to 22-year-old college educated students, and the rest of the population is ignored.
Yeah, that's like 90% of psychology research. So
I was surprised.
Oh yeah, linguistics too.
Even the Beck Institute, I took a training from them 2 years ago when I did a year of being a therapist, and even they admitted that, everything they've done has been basically, at a University of Pennsylvania college students, and all their proof, they even admit themselves, they don't really, they believe it's true, but they don't know how much their studies should be relied on. And you end up with the whole evidence-based movement that is, hard for people that can't really study psychoanalysis and things like that.
I think we just lost Jasmine.
We lost Jasmine. Is this part of the activity?
Yeah, I thought everyone was looking strange when I was talking. I thought, what did I do?
No, just
back. Okay. I'm not sure. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yeah.
This has happened before. I knew I should have went to my campus office. I'm so sorry about that, you all. Let me see if I can. I know
fine up until that point. So
okay, good. All right. Let me go ahead and reshare my screen. Can you all see that? The last slide we were on? Okay. Awesome. So sorry about that. Michael, I didn't hear the last part of what you were saying. But
I was just thinking about how, things that aren't so easy to research, in psychology treatments become disadvantaged.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So what I like to do the last five-ish minutes or so, let me actually get to the slide here. Yeah, I had a lot planned for y'all. I was very ambitious in this presentation. I'd like to go ahead and I guess you could say kind of quiz you all. But I say that like in a very just way because I'm just very curious as we read through these research abstracts whether or not you think they are an example of what could be DEIJ oriented research. And just for full transparency, when I took a feminist research class last year, one of my professors did a very similar activity. I changed a little bit of it, but there are some similarities. So I did gain inspiration from this professor. So I think giving credit is very important in this type of situation. All right. So first abstract I'm going to show you all. Do you want me to read it out loud or would you prefer if you read it to yourselves? I know people have different preferences. I'll just have y'all read it to yourselves. All right. Go ahead and read this and then think about whether or not you think it's DEIJ oriented research. Does anyone still need more time to read? Okay. So what do you all think? Unsure is an answer too. Okay. You can either share your thoughts in the chat or if you feel comfortable, you can unmute. What are we thinking tentatively? Yes, it is.
I'm going to, this probably isn't like the right way to come about this decision, but I have
No,
come to
right,
learn that basically everything I've been trained in was very biased and very centered in a patriarchal white viewpoint. So if a study is how I was trained, it's probably not DEI.
Okay. And in Virginia, you're saying that because you're like, wow, this is reminding me a lot.
This looks like something I totally would have read in my social psychology course in grad school.
Okay. Okay. Fair enough. So Virginia is going to
And
say
it does have, yes,
probably
it's the
not.
deficit point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah,
am
that's what
thinking it
immediately
is.
stood out to me is that deficit point mentioned earlier of like looking at something from a deficit point, like do negative stereotypes about feminists serve as a barrier to self-identifying?
Mm-hmm.
That stood out to me. So it feels like it's trying to be DEIJ, but
Yes, it is trying
And for
for sure.
2007, it was probably pretty good.
But
You got to realize if it was published in 2007, they did this study 20 years ago.
but it
Yes.
is an important question, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
I want to hear more from you, Michael. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, if you can prove that negative stereotypes about feminists serves as a barrier to self-identifying as a feminist, you can get
Mm-hmm.
funding to help foster positive feminist awareness campaigns, for example. You know
Mm-hmm.
what I mean? Just coming off for the first thing off my head. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it can do good.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I hear
I'm
you.
thinking in
My
terms of,
point of view is like it is not
Okay.
based on this design between participants
Mm.
design because we are just comparing and contrasting.
And it should not stop there. It needs to go beyond, like you were mentioning, like the history behind it.
Mm-hmm.
Why do they think the way they think? So we need
Yeah,
to bring
yeah.
in some qualitative elements to develop a better understanding.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Michael, Michael and Aditya, I think you're bringing up very good points. So, Michael, I hear you saying, and I know we only have 2 more minutes left. So I'm gonna wrap it up here very, very soon. Virginia, I know you have to hop off. Michael, I hear you saying that there is it's an important question, is what I'm hearing you say. It's a valid question, is what I'm hearing you say. And I agree with you. I think Nadita also has a good point in the sense of how we're going about answering that question, right? And honestly, when I first read this and again, y'all, I'm just giving you an abstract. Like I mean, we haven't read the entire study, so it obviously is going to give us a lot more information. And we know these abstracts are important in terms of getting our readers to understand what it is that we're trying to do in our research. But all of that to say, y'all, when I saw here women, I thought, well, what kind of women are they talking about? Are they talking about cis women, trans women, white women, black women? And so going back to how DEIJ research should be intersectional in nature, that's not really clear. What do we mean by negative stereotypes, and to whom are they negative, right? So I identify as a feminist. I would say I'm very quote unquote opinionated. To some, that might be a negative stereotype. I don't know. And so I think, to Michael's point, it's asking a good question, but the way in which the actual research design, I think that's what Nadita was getting at. It stops too short. And I think Andy was kind of, I can't remember if it was Andy or Virginia, to be honest with you, was kind of alluding to that as well. So I think this is a great example of how we kind of think that we're doing this DEIJ research, but we're actually stopping ourselves way too short because we're not operationalizing our questions, our design all the way through. We're carrying this DEIJ lens all the way through. Does that make sense? All right. Oh, go ahead. If people need to hop off, you can surely do that. I know folks have things to do, but I'm going to go ahead and stop it there. Michael, I'm not trying to cut you off. Go ahead and ask your question. I just wanted to make sure if they need to hop off, people can.
I'm wondering, I asked if it's a valid question. I mean, maybe it is a valid question, but not necessarily a DEIJ question. Does every valid question have to be a DEIJ question?
No, no.
Because I mean,
Absolutely
you have
not.
it's similar questions to like people with mental illness, stigma,
Correct.
same type of thing, and very similar type of question. And now that I'm thinking about it, it does sound like it's a deficit type of question.